Hey, what's going on, everybody? James here, and we are back with another watch collecting topics video. So thanks for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe to the video and the channel if you've not been here before. Today we're going to talk about how to compare two watches. How do I choose between two watches? Hashtag the struggle is real. So let's take a look. And I've got two watches in front of me today, but I'm not going to talk about these two watches specifically. I'm going to talk a little bit broader, right? Because you're not always going to have such a simple comparison of these two watches next to each other. So we're going to dive into what are the things that you should consider when you're debating between two watches. We've all been in that spot where maybe we're looking at a couple of different pieces. Maybe it's more than two, but you get it down, you narrow it down, and then there's only two. And you say to yourself, my gosh, how do I decide between these two watches? Well, that's what I'm going to walk you through today. And again, we're going to give you the principles, the ideas behind how to make these choices in no particular order, although I did try to order them in terms of what I think might be the order of importance, but it's not necessarily going to be the same for you. It might be a little bit different. And again, that's okay. So let's dive in. The first thing I think you want to consider is brand. Now, again, we've got a Rolex, we've got a Grand Seiko. Both are amazing brands with very different stories, very different heritage. And so you've got to say to yourself, okay, what affinity do I have? What love do I have for the brand? Again, Rolex, more associated with sports, more associated with milestones, achievement, those types of things, versus Grand Seiko, more associated with the history and the story of the nature of where they're made and those types of things, right? So what affinity do you have for the brand? Second thing that you're going to look at is the aesthetic. Now, we're going to dive into several different aspects of the aesthetic. The first one I think that's relevant is the metal. What is the watch actually made out of? In this case, both of these watches are steel, but there's not, you have a lot of choices out there these days. So you could have steel, you could have titanium, you could have tantalum, you could have precious metal. There's so many different options. And so when you think about your collection, and maybe you're deciding between what's going to be your one watch, right? You want to think about what that metal is going to do for you, or maybe make more challenging. And I'll get into the function in a second, but metal for me is an important one to consider. Most of mine are steel, but that's just a personal choice. You may not want that. So something to think about. Next, I gotta look at the dial, right? If I'm going to buy a watch, it's gotta have a catchy, visually appealing dial. And again, we've got two very different ones here. One with more of a sunburst, sun ray type of dial, and I'm doing a terrible job of capturing it in this lighting. So let me try to make it there. You can get it a little bit better on the Sky Dweller here. And then you have the Grand Seiko, very different. This is the Skyflake dial. It's a limited edition of what was the Skyflake that was released in the Japan markets. So not something that you'll see very often, but the dial is familiar to many folks who are familiar with Grand Seiko. So what does the dial look like? And what, is there a color theme in the collection? Are you, like me, where I'm primarily focused on blues? Like, what is the dial? Why is it catchy? What aspects of the dial, right? The hour markers, the way the hands look. We have a video about the different style hands, baton style hands versus like Dauphine style. So there's so many different things that you can look at there. We're kind of talking a little bit more about the next thing I had on my list in the aesthetic category, which is detail, right? So you got to look at this Grand Seiko for a second and just appreciate the fact that not only does it have a Skyflake dial, but you've got the, polished, Zaratsu polished hands and indices here. But you also have a blued seconds hand that's fire blue, which is really cool. And then you also have this neat blue chapter ring around the outside that kind of disappears in some senses when you're looking at it at a certain angle, but then in others you really see that blue pop, and it just makes the watch have a very different color. Honestly, it makes it look more colorful. So those are the types of details that you have to think about. Again, this one is pretty clean, and this is a lot busier. They're both relatively harmonious. They both have dates on the right side of them. There's a lot of symmetry going on. Again, you'll find that theme in my collection in general, but those are all things that you want to consider, right? What are those small little details that may make the difference? Like, for instance, on the Grand Seiko, we've got a gold GS logo. Not a lot of Grand Seikos have that, because this is a limited edition, which we'll talk about later. This is something to consider. So that's the aesthetic. Now, function. Function is a big one, because a watch can be great, and there have been points in my journey when I've had this where, man, I really like this watch, but you know what? It just doesn't make sense for what I'm trying to do. So complications would be the first thing. What do you got on the actual watch, based on the movement? You can call this movement, whatever you want to say. And so here, again, we have 2 date watches. In the Rolex's case, it's actually an annual calendar and a GMT, which is pretty awesome. So you got a lot of functionality built into a single watch there. So, do you need the complications, or is it just a nice to have, right? Do I want a simple 3-hander because I like the way it looks and I don't need that? Or am I looking at, putting this into a collection where I might want a travel piece? And that is the next thing within function is, what's the use case? When am I actually going to wear this watch? Because if I have 4 watches that cover the same use case, that may not be something that I'm really looking for. Now, depending on the size of your collection, you may have lots of watches that meet the same use case. That's okay. But I think, again, for most people that have some sense of, there's a budget constraint on their collection, they don't just have unlimited funds to spend on every single piece that they see, there's probably going to be some conversation, some consideration around, is this functionality going to add to my collection, or is it something that I already have? And then again, what are the other pieces in my collection, and how is this going to fit into that? If I don't have a travel watch and all I have is divers, do I want something like this that I could use for travel, or am I just only doing divers? Because that's okay too. So you got to consider the complications, the use case. Can I change the bracelet and throw it on a strap to make it look a little bit different? All those things are good questions and considerations. And then last is the story of the watch. And this, I could take this 2 different ways. One is kind of going back to brand a little bit. What's the story behind the brand and maybe that particular watch? Do you have some association to it that makes you more likely, more apt to purchase the watch? But more along with this is, what's the story of how it connects to me? Am I tying this, again, going back to something like a Rolex? Did I get a big promotion at work? Did I have the birth of a child? Did I start a business? Like, what was it that's getting you in the space where you're ready to buy a watch like this? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but that's something that you could think about as you're buying that watch. And the other piece of that story aspect or element of it is this something that I could always get, or is this kind of a once in a lifetime or once in a while opportunity? So again, neither of these are incredibly rare watches. It is a 255 piece limited edition, but relatively speaking, that's not a small limited run. That's kind of a decent sized limited run. Blue Sky Dwellers in general are a little bit less common than many Rolexes, but if you look on the secondary market, they're not hard to find, right? So that's the other question to ask yourself when you're looking at and debating between 2 watches is, hey, if I have a model, like this is a great example, right? Though less common, it is a standard production Rolex. They're going to keep making these. Versus something like this where, again, it's 255 pieces, and after they produce those, that's it. Then I'm going to have to wait around in the secondary and try and find one. So that may influence which one I go with. So those are kind of my 4 key things, or 4 categories, if you will, of what I should consider when I'm trying to choose between 2 watches. So the first one, again, is brand. The second one is the aesthetic. What's the metal? What's the dial like? What are the little details that make it attractive to me? Then third is function. Again, the complications that it has. What are the use cases for this watch, and how does it fit into my existing collection? Maybe I'm going to use it as only a single watch. Maybe I'm a 1-watch guy. Then it's got to be versatile, right? That's all something to consider. And then last, 4th, is the story. Again, what's the story? Not only behind the brand, but what's the story as it relates to you? And are there production constraints where I may not be able to get one if I hold out because it's a limited edition or something like that. So I hope that that was interesting. I hope that that is helpful, because ultimately that's my goal for you, is really to get, again, out of watches whatever you want to get out of watches. And then that means it's going to be important for you to have some guiding ideas when you're trying to make those choices and decide between different watches. So, because ultimately I want you to be a satisfied collector at the end of the day and love what you have. So thanks again for stopping by. Please like, comment, and subscribe to the video and to the channel, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.